You know what's interesting? When someone deeply empathetic encounters an avoidant person, the kind who withdraws, shuts down, and builds walls, the empath's first instinct is to lean in. They want to understand, to fix, to heal. They pour love into the gaps, hoping it'll soften the ice. But here's the twist. The true revenge of a super empath isn't loud. It doesn't look like anger, shouting, or begging. Their revenge is silent. It's the quiet, powerful shift from giving their energy away to finally protecting it. Because when an empath stops chasing coldness, something magical happens. They remember their worth. They stop auditioning for scraps of affection. And they realize that their deepest superpower was never in convincing someone else to love them. It was in choosing to love themselves enough to walk away from emotional starvation. The avoidant may think silence is their weapon, but when the empath learns it too, that's the moment the game changes. The empath's silence isn't avoidance, it's healing. And that is the most powerful, silent revenge of all. When someone with a deeply empathetic nature encounters the coldness of an avoidant personality, their instinctive reaction is almost always to lean in closer. It's not because they're weak or desperate, but because their emotional wiring compels them to care, to fix, and to connect. An empath feels emotions in a way that is almost amplified. They can sense tension in a room before a word is spoken. They notice subtle changes in tone, and they can read between the lines of silence. So, when they're met with avoidance, the shutting down, the emotional withdrawal, the sudden distance, it doesn't register as rejection in the beginning. Instead, it registers as pain in the other person. The empath thinks something must be wrong here. They must be hurting, and I need to help. This is where the cycle begins. The empath starts leaning in, offering reassurance, affection, patience, and understanding. They ask gentle questions. They give more space than feels comfortable. They hold back their own needs because they believe the avoidant needs time to feel safe. It becomes almost like a dance where one person takes a step back and the other takes a step forward, hoping the gap will close if they just give enough love. The empath isn't chasing out of insecurity at first. They're chasing because their compassion interprets the avoidance distance as a wound to be healed. What makes this even more powerful is that empaths often have a history of being caretakers. Maybe they learned early in life that their value comes from being the one who smooths things over, who anticipates needs, who keeps the peace. So when an avoidant partner pulls away, it's not only triggering their empathy, it's also touching an old pattern, a familiar role they know how to play. They think, if I can just love harder, if I can just prove I'm safe, this person will finally open up. And so they lean further in, pouring out energy, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. The avoidant, however, often perceives this closeness as pressure. What feels like warmth to the empath feels like suffocation to the avoidant. And because the avoidance defense mechanism is withdrawal, the more the empath leans in, the more the avoidant pulls back. It's a loop that can leave the empath feeling confused, unworthy, and even rejected when in reality, their heart was only trying to connect. The tragedy in this dynamic is that the empath's gift, their ability to feel deeply and respond with compassion, becomes the very thing that drains them. They start to forget that relationships require reciprocity. They forget that while empathy is beautiful, it cannot be one-sided. And yet, in those early stages, leaning in feels almost irresistible. They are drawn by the hope that if they can just love enough, the avoidant will finally let down the walls and reveal the tenderness that must be hiding underneath. The most surprising thing about revenge in this context is that it doesn't look the way people imagine it. It's not fiery confrontations, it's not slamming doors, it's not shouting or pointing fingers. The most profound revenge of the empath against the avoidant is silent, subtle, and deeply powerful. At first, silence was the avoidance tool. They used withdrawal to control the rhythm of the relationship, to create distance, to protect themselves from intimacy that felt overwhelming. But when the empath learns to use silence too, everything shifts. It's not about copying the avoidance coldness, but about reclaiming their own energy, about finally realizing that they don't need to prove their love or their loyalty through endless words and actions. The empath's silence becomes a language of self-respect. There comes a moment when the empath grows tired of always reaching across the gap. They grow tired of asking questions that never get answers, of extending invitations that are met with indifference, of carrying the emotional load while the avoidant remains locked in their fortress. And instead of escalating, instead of demanding attention, they simply stop, Not in a passive-aggressive way, not in a sulking way, but in a calm, almost serene way. They stop explaining themselves, stop justifying their feelings, stop trying to decode every sigh and every pause. They discover that silence is not emptiness, it is space. And in that space, the empath begins to heal. The avoidant, who once relied on silence as a shield, now finds it reflected back at them. But this silence feels different. It doesn't come from fear of intimacy. It comes from strength. It's not avoidance. It's release. It's the empath saying, without saying anything at all, I will no longer chase what is running away from me. I will no longer invest in a heart that refuses to meet me halfway. This kind of silence carries weight because it cannot be argued with. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be pulled into a game of push and pull. It's a silence that stands tall, radiating self-worth. What makes this silent revenge so impactful is that it rewrites the story. For so long, the empath played the role of the giver, the one who filled in the spaces the avoidant left blank. Their love, their attention, their compassion filled the silence with meaning. But when they stop filling those gaps, the avoidant is left with the emptiness they created. The empath's quiet is not cruel. It's clarifying. It shines a light on the imbalance, exposing the reality of the connection without the cushioning of endless empathy. The power of this silent revenge is that it doesn't destroy the empath. It restores them. It gives them back the energy they once poured into someone else's coldness. It shows the avoidant, in the most dignified way possible, that the empath has stepped out of the old dance. And perhaps the avoidant doesn't even realize at first what has changed, but they will feel the difference. The pursuit, the reassurance, the constant presence that once soothed their distance is gone. What remains is silence, steady, confident, unshakable silence. There comes a point in the empath's journey where the exhaustion of giving without receiving forces a powerful realization. Their worth was never meant to be measured by how much love they can extract from someone else. Up until then, the dynamic with the avoidant often felt like an endless audition. Every gesture of kindness, every act of patience, every moment of forgiveness carried the hidden hope that maybe this time the avoidant would see them, appreciate them, and finally reciprocate. But when that reciprocity doesn't come, the empath begins to face the painful truth that they cannot earn what someone else is unwilling to give. This is the turning point. The moment when self-worth shifts from being an external negotiation to an internal decision. An empath's heart is naturally oriented outward. They feel valuable when they are giving, when they are soothing, when they are making others feel seen and understood. But this outward focus becomes dangerous in the presence of avoidance. The avoidance distance, indifference, or emotional walls can subtly teach the empath to work harder for approval. The message becomes, if you were lovable enough, I would stay. If you were good enough, I would open up. If you were worthy enough, I wouldn't pull away. And without even realizing it, the empath begins to internalize this narrative, wearing themselves out in the process. But then comes that quiet, almost defiant awakening, my worth is not up for debate here. What makes this realization so powerful is that it untangles the empath from the avoidance behavior. The avoidance coldness is no longer a mirror reflecting the empath's inadequacy. It is simply a reflection of the avoidant's own wounds and defenses. The empath begins to separate who they are from how they are treated. They recognize that the endless audition was a performance in the wrong theater. And instead of trying to prove their worth to someone emotionally unavailable, they start investing that worth into themselves. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of reclaiming parts of themselves they had abandoned along the way. It's remembering the friendships, passions, and values that once brought them joy outside of this dynamic. It's rebuilding the voice inside that says, I am enough, even when unacknowledged. Slowly, they begin to realize that love, at its healthiest, is not about proving, but about sharing. And any connection that demands proof of value is already misaligned. The avoidant may not notice this change immediately. They may assume the empath is still waiting in the wings, ready to comfort, ready to explain, ready to fight for closeness. But the empath is no longer operating from the place of scarcity that once fueled the chase. Their worth is no longer conditional on how much they are accepted. It is now rooted in an unshakable knowing they are enough simply by existing, with or without the avoidance recognition. Silence has always carried weight in the dynamic between an empath and an avoidant, but its meaning shifts entirely when the empath learns how to use it. In the beginning, silence feels like punishment. The avoidant withdraws, and the empath interprets that quiet as rejection, abandonment, or a sign that something is wrong with them. It becomes an agonizing void the empath rushes to fill with reassurance, apologies, or overcompensating gestures of love. Every unanswered text, every delayed response, every cold stare becomes a reminder of distance. But over time, the empath begins to discover that silence can hold a very different kind of power, one that heals rather than harms. When the empath chooses silence, it doesn't come from fear or defense, it comes from clarity. They no longer see the absence of words as something that needs to be patched up. Instead, they recognize it as space, a pause that allows them to breathe, to think, and to center themselves again. Silence stops being a cage and becomes a sanctuary. It's the difference between being silenced and choosing silence. That choice changes everything. It says, I don't need to chase you into your walls. I don't need to exhaust myself explaining my worth. I don't need to fill this gap with noise to prove that I matter. The empath's silence is powerful because it breaks the old pattern. For so long, they responded to the avoidant's withdrawal with pursuit. That pursuit fed the cycle, giving the avoidant both control and confirmation that they could disappear and still be chased. But when the empath embraces silence, the cycle collapses. There is no pursuit. There is no performance. There is only stillness. And in that stillness, the empath regains their balance. This silence is not coldness, it's warmth turned inward. It is the empath taking the compassion they once gave so freely to the avoidant and redirecting it toward themselves. It looks like choosing not to explain every feeling, not to beg for attention, not to translate their own needs into palatable fragments. It looks like resting in the knowledge that if someone cannot meet them halfway, it is not their responsibility to carry the entire bridge. This kind of silence doesn't wound the empath, it restores them. What's remarkable is how this silence transforms the power dynamic. The avoidant, who once relied on withdrawal to feel safe, is suddenly met with an absence that feels different. It is not desperate, it is not needy, it is not waiting. It is simply there, calm and steady. And that kind of silence cannot be ignored. It forces the avoidant to sit with the emptiness they have created without the buffer of the empath's constant effort. For the empath, silence becomes a language of boundaries. It communicates without confrontation. It says, I choose peace over chaos, self-respect over chasing, dignity over depletion. And in that choice, silence evolves from something that once hurt into something that heals. Healing is not dramatic, and it rarely announces itself with a grand gesture. For the empath, true healing often begins in small, almost invisible moments. The decision to no longer reply instantly to a cold message, the ability to sit with their own company without needing validation, the quiet recognition that they are no longer trying to change someone who has chosen distance. These subtle shifts add up to something profound. They are the markers of freedom, the evidence that the empath has stepped out of emotional starvation and into emotional nourishment. When an empath has spent months or even years pouring themselves into a connection with an avoidant, healing can feel like reclaiming lost parts of themselves. It is remembering the dreams that were put on hold while waiting for the avoidant to come around. It is rediscovering the laughter that once came easily but got replaced by endless analysis of mixed signals. Healing is not about bitterness, it is about rebalancing the scales. The empath begins to see that their love was never the problem. Their capacity to feel deeply, to care fully, to give generously, that was always their gift. The issue was directing those gifts into a space that never reciprocated. Healing means redirecting that love inward, toward themselves, and then outward toward relationships that are reciprocal, steady, and nourishing. The ultimate victory for the empath is not in making the avoidant regret their distance. It is not in proving a point or winning a hidden battle. The victory lies in the quiet act of no longer craving what once depleted them. That shift is where the true power resides. The avoidant may remain unchanged, locked in their patterns, but the empath no longer orbits around that gravity. They step into a new center, one defined by self-respect and genuine connection. Healing also transforms the way the empath sees relationships. No longer do they mistake intensity for intimacy or distance for mystery. They learn to recognize that love should feel safe, consistent, and mutual. They begin to place value not on how much they can give, but on how balanced the exchange feels. They start to ask, do I feel seen here? Do I feel safe here? Do I feel loved without having to prove myself every day? These questions guide them away from the cycle of over, giving, and toward a life filled with people who meet them in the middle. The most beautiful part of this healing is how it restores the empath's energy. What was once drained by constant pursuit is now invested in creativity, friendships, passions, and self-care. Their silence is no longer empty, it is full of possibility. Their boundaries are no longer walls, they are gates allowing love in but keeping depletion out. And that is the empath's ultimate revenge, though it doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like liberation. It feels like choosing life, love, and peace over the exhaustion of begging for warmth from someone committed to being cold. So in the end, the story of the super empath and the avoidant isn't one of defeat. It's not about chasing someone who never turned around, and it's not about being left broken by their coldness. It's about transformation. What began as pain becomes power. What once felt like rejection turns into redirection. The empath discovers that their heart was never meant to shrink to fit someone else's walls. It was meant to expand into spaces where it can be seen, valued, and returned with equal warmth. The silent revenge of the super empath is not cruelty, it's clarity. It's the quiet confidence of knowing their worth. It's the courage to stop chasing and start choosing. It's the dignity of walking away from emptiness and walking toward abundance. And when they do, they don't just heal, they inspire. They show that